Hi, this is Dan Hickey. This is a recording of a presentation made at the Defense Language Institute at a design sprint, uh, October 2019. So I'm at Indiana University. I'm a professor of learning sciences. Um, I have a bunch of other affiliations with some awesome colleagues who I have the pleasure of working with and learning a lot of what I'll be talking about today. I've been at IU since 2005. And I'd say thanks to the sponsors of the work I'll be talking about today. I couldn't have done it without them, and I really appreciate their support. So my understanding of the courses at the Foreign Language Center at the Defense Learning Institute is that these courses are very intensive and that they're very effective, notoriously effective, that in what I guess about 120 days you can take people from being unfamiliar with a language to being able to speak a language fluently. They rely on traditional face-to-face instruction with textbook homework. Uh, Primary use of technology has been conventional audio-visual, as is common in many second language courses. Their courses are very functional. They're mostly focused on linguistic fluency, spoken fluency, and they rely a lot on the subsequent in-country posts for students to pick up the additional context and culture for a cryptolinguist to be successful. My understanding is the in-country postings can still be difficult and sometimes even traumatic for some. Uh, my understanding, I know that my student Grant Chartrand, during his post, he said that they still relied a lot on native translators, that their cryptolinguists weren't as effective. My goal, if I were engaged, is to find a way or to use a specific way to boost linguistic fluency dramatically, but do so in a way that also develops cultural and contextual competencies that they will have ready to use when they get posted in country in a way that will allow them to transfer their course knowledge to those settings more effectively. We do so using what I call expansive framing. This is using real or imaginary framing to contextualize their engagement during the regular coursework, and to do so in ways that takes advantage of widely available technology. My perspective on learning and assessment is a little bit different than most of the people here. Um, Starting in the 80s, I studied military solutions for marginally literate draftees, the Vietnam era so-called Project 100,000. Went and got my PhD in cognitive science from Vanderbilt. I studied with Jim Pellegrino and Susan Goldman. Really got a traditional cognitive psych training. Uh, while I was a postdoc at Educational Testing Service for a couple of years, um, I really embraced newer so-called situative perspectives because I was discovering that they really revealed new, surprisingly effective approaches to the kinds of dilemmas that face when you try to implement formative and summative assessment in real classrooms. Over the years, across several faculty positions, I developed what I called my multi-level assessment of uh, multi-level model of assessment in collaboration with leading technology innovators. Really important for me was some mid-career mentoring I got from the linguist James G. He and others have been critical of my multi-level assessment model because it lacked sort of a theory of talk, and that led me into Randi Engle's work that I'm going to be talking about today. He and later pushed me, once I put this model together, to really find ways to share it broadly with people. And I shifted to online courses around 2009. So Randy, who died tragically young in 2012, introduced this notion of PDE back in 2002. It's been pretty widely taken up in the learning sciences and in educational psychology. So engagement that is disciplinary, right? So engagement, right, it's making substantive coordinated contributions to discussions, right? This is not a cognitive model of engagement, it's a discursive model of engagement. Such engagement is disciplinary when it concerns the issues and practices of the discipline's discourse. You know, they walk in the walk and talk in the talk of an experts in their own way. Now that disciplinary engagement is productive when it makes intellectual progress, addresses problems, asks questions, makes connections, etc. This resulted in 4 PDE design principles. The first and most important one that has been taken up quite widely, this idea is you want to problematize content from each learner's own perspective. So rather than problem-based learning where experts often define authentic problems that are authentic to the discipline, you want to sort of open up problems that experts might see as closed. Doing so allows you to give students authority to solve those problems, uh, and to hold students accountable to the discipline and each other. And you have to provide, obviously, resources to accomplish this. Subsequent model that was really the last thing that Randi did before passing was this idea of expansive framing. This was in a special issue of Educational Psychologist, also featured an article by Joanne Lobato on actor-oriented transfer. Joanne had also, in her writing, been critical of my earlier work, similar to Jim G, and helped push me into the perspective I'm going to talk about today. This is theoretically based on this idea of intercontextuality. You want students to make numerous personalized connections with the content, and expansive framing does so by pushing students to find connections with people, places, topics, and times beyond the boundaries of the course. This further positions students as authors of new disciplinary knowledge while they're in the course, rather than consumers of that knowledge. And it helps students hold themselves and their peers accountable for participation in the discipline's discourse. So this is indeed different from most characterizations of personalized learning with technology. Now, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with that there's a pretty extensive uh, Vygotskian research base that is broadly similar in second language instruction. Lantoff and Thorne, there's their latest contribution, that 2002 text is widely used. Now, most of this work tends to be very naturalistic. They're using a qualitative methodology to study discourse, the discourse that makes up the second language classrooms. The more interventionist work in this tradition, as I best can tell, it is predominantly what we see in computer-assisted language learning and in CSCL, computer-supported collaborative learning, most notably Mark Warschauer's work. Mark's a friend. I'm not that familiar with this part of his work. There's very little use of situated cognition, as in the work of James Greeno and Randi Engle in second language instruction. Indeed, I searched high and low and confirmed that most of the work is represented by Adam Mendelssohn's dissertation, who was Randi's student and also was a Spanish instructor while he was. So for about a decade now, I've been doing design-based research where you're really trying to derive design principles you saw earlier in Randi's work on PDE. This is what defines the learning sciences, rather than trying to identify sort of fundamental theories or to take basic research from cognitive and developmental psychology and then do applied research with that, as is in its psych. Learning science is really about doing work in learning context and deriving principles and identifying the features of the context that others would need to be aware of to apply those principles in their own setting. So dozens of contexts, dozens of courses, dozens of other instructors have used this method successfully. So one of the bases of the last piece of mentoring that Jim really pushed hard on me was he really felt that my work was too theoretical and too hard, really impossible to understand if you weren't already grounded in situative theories of learning. So much of my work these days is about presenting this approach in a way that someone who might be grounded in cognitive theories of learning or is not grounded in any theory of learning at all, might be able to do this. And so these 11 steps are what I have now. These are out in several chapters. An important volume in educational technology currently under review. I'm not going to have time to get through all of them, but I hope to give you a sense of what this might look like in a second language course. The examples I'll use are from a course that I've been teaching since 2005. The most important thing about this course is that the instructor is really busy. As I'll show you, I go to great lengths to maximize my public engagement with the students and minimize my private engagement. In particular, minimize the time I spend giving private feedback on completed student work, which may or may not be used. I think that's really a really problematic thing about a lot of online courses. If they're good, particularly if they're inquiry oriented, what I see is a lot of instructors spending enormous amount of time giving private feedback that in many cases students might not use at all. I think this course is relevant to the goals of language education because what I was really trying to do is help teachers, administrators, and researchers use the language of assessment so that they might engage in productive kinds of disciplinary engagement about assessment subsequently on their jobs. The first step is to define a personalized framing context. So each student defines this context. Turns out to be a good way to introduce students to each other. Now, this does require creativity and knowledge of the course content. So, as I'll show you, in a course like mine, it's relatively easy because these students come into this course with a role and a goal, right? Most of them are practicing teachers. And so the very first assignment has them introduce their home page where uh, all of their completed assignments are located. And this is pretty straightforward. Try to imagine how your setting will shape your understanding of the practices, principles, and policies of assessment. So from the very beginning, we're pushing them. And here's one example. You notice I switched to orange. That means that I'm showing you an example. This is drawn from a fairly typical student in my most recent summer course. And here you can see she's a special ed teacher. She's accepted a position. She's not a special ed teacher yet, but I'm pushing her to think of that role during her class. So I want to become knowledgeable. The role I'm choosing is that of a special education teacher and an IEP implementer. In terms of shaping my understanding, I want to push principles and practices to lead to inclusion and support. So she's already able to do this. Now, the important thing, some students may struggle to do this. For instance, when I have students who are in the instructional systems technology program, they find this more difficult. And by looking at peer example, it's a lot easier for them. So I do this in two parts. So I have them draft a curricular aim, right? So again, this is challenging for some students. Not for this student. She's got enough experience. She's able to do it. Again, students in instructional systems technology, even more so. Now notice her aim here is really not entirely that. It's more of a curricular goal, a design of a curriculum. Within a week or two, this does become reframed. What she'll discover, it'll be very difficult to develop a multiple choice item for that aim, and she'll adapt the aim accordingly. So this is my hypothetical framing assignment in a second language course. I might have students introduce themselves on their home page, describe yourself before the service, your current and future roles, and then come up with a linguistic scenario. Like start imagining what you'd be doing in country. Now, again, some students will struggle with this, but other students will actually have some sort of experience and be able to draft it. And then go say hello to your classmates. Look at their work. So this is a way you get this is where one of my concerns about a lot of personalized engagement is personalized isn't the right word. I think isolated is the right word. That's not going to advance them in linguistic fluency. Step two, define an introductory engagement routine. So you want to introduce this expansive framing routine where you problematize introductory content from their own perspective. Again, this is a good way. Once students have introduced themselves to each other, now you can introduce the students to the course and the resources. And this, if you take away anything from my talk today, it's the simple routine of having students rank the relevance of information that they need to learn relative to their own context and then justify that ranking and interact with peers who are doing the same. It's an incredibly effective way to get students to make sense of incredibly complicated course concepts. So let me show you what that looks like. Let me show you what that looks like. So in P507, from the very start, in the very first assignment, we have them read chapter 1. And I tell them, look, if you work in K-12 settings, you're going to need to focus on 5 through 8. If you're an administrator, 8 and 9 is probably more important. If you're an advanced student, so I'm already telling them, look, you're going to each engage with this in a personalized way that's going to reflect your roles and goals from this course. Now, Chapter 2, though, there's this fairly complicated thing in considerations about what to assess. And they're asked to write a summary of each of those 9 considerations in order of most relevant to least relevant, and to say a few things, but from their own perspectives. Now, if you'll notice there below, if you've not thought about this before, this will be challenging. Look at your peer work if you're struggling. And so this is that same student. You can see, I had a hard time with this section. What's really important here is they've already learned from the first assignment that nobody's evaluating directly what they're writing. And so it opens it up. They get to adapt the assignment because they understand already the kind of engagement we're looking for. Right? So there you can see she picked the first two that she thought were most relevant, and she took away some really important stuff that's really, and she made a connection with the assignment and my design of the course. So that's what we mean by productive disciplinary engagement. Here's what this might look like in a second language course. Reframe your linguistic role and context. So this is really important. Each week they restate. I'm going to call it role and context. I'm not sure if that's the right thing, but rather rewrite it from memory, because as they're interacting with students and thinking about it, their understanding of their linguistic scenario, or whatever we ended up calling it, is going to expand, and they can better and better articulate that and better use that to imagine how they'll use course content. So in this case, let's have them go through this. Most courses, they have policies and they have learning outcomes. It's always a drag. Students never read them. Well, if you do this, they will, because they can't do something like this without clearly articulating which one's most relevant and providing a justification. So something really important happens here, and that is when they do the first assignment, right, they're going to skim these things. They're going to go like, oh, I didn't connect them. They're going to have to go back and revisit them to provide that justification. That there's an anthropological notion of prolepsis, and that is the way that the future shapes the present. Just that simple act of doing assignment 2 means that when they get to part 3 of the assignment, they're not going to skim over the course outcomes. They're going to read them carefully from their own perspective to search for the one that's most relevant. So you make that happen. You have them do it first on content that's not relatively difficult. They understand it. I'm able to provide feedback to them and say, hey, great job. Or, no, that looks like you're talking about it in general. You didn't really say about it more specifically for you. Once you've done this, then you can define your primary engagement routines, literally for every assignment for the remainder of the course. You can use variations. In some ways, the content will afford some sort of ranking. When it doesn't, you can use the ranking routine. You can apply this to most educational resources. You can use curated content that are provided by text chapters, often using the summaries or the implications. In many of my courses, I'll find the best open educational resources out there that I can find. Not only will I have students rank those resources, I'll have them rank the content in those resources. So for example, well on into the course in week 6, we get to something really complicated. This is validity. In the past, I've been happy if my students just understood that validity is a property of evidence, so there's no such thing as a valid assessment. But rather, that's reliability. Validity is really about the validity of some scores relative to an argument. This is really complicated. So that same student who struggled a little bit with the assignment in week 2 now really kills it. She really understands that these 4 different kinds of evidence and is able to articulate her ranking. In particular, what I usually do is say, why is the first most relevant, and why is that one is less pertinent to my aim, as I feel this is for checking certain skills such as math and science. Absolutely. That came from looking at peer work. So what this might look like in a Russian course, I know my good friend Ben Eklof, who's a history professor, whose girlfriend is also is a Russian professor, gave me some help with thinking through what this might look like. Now, I haven't run this back by him yet, but I'm hoping he'll get time to look at this. He explained to me that in Russian, a very difficult thing for students to learn is that intonation. So spoken Russian, all languages, intonation is important, but it's particularly important in intonation. And this is something that many Russian students struggle, and I suspect that Russian students here at the Foreign Language Center really struggle with. So it might look like this, it might not, but I'm assuming. So the important part is, notice the first part of this assignment has them restate their role and context, right? So as their knowledge is growing, have them imagine more and more how they might do this, and how something like intonation might be relevant to something that they can imagine when they're in their field posting. So I imagine that there's some sort of guidelines, some print guidelines that they have to read. Read those guidelines to make sure students read them. Write at least a sentence about each of them. Rearrange the guidelines in order of relevance. They may need to complete the next step to complete this part. Right? So let's say we record some examples here. Here's 4 different examples that a native speaker, and so this is where now this takes some real work to come up with these. But in my experience, most subject matter experts may struggle with this, but experienced instructors can generate these things on the fly, create these kinds of routines and resources. These resources, for instance, we learned about this. The Lumiere resource that has numerous clips, right? There's tons of stuff like this out there on the open web to borrow from. This does take time and work, but once this is done, and once these are refined over time in a course, they can be remarkably effective. Now, what's particularly important about these is that I ask students to post a question to their peers after they complete this assignment, and then ask students to go out and examine the work of 3 peers. Notice that I'm not requiring students to discuss. I'll elaborate on this later if I have time, but you're really asking them to, uh, uh, you know, don't answer somebody's question if you don't know the answer to it. The next step is defining some secondary engagement routines. Uh, these are introduced further on in the course. They build on the artifacts and insights generated by the primary, that are generated by the primary routine. So, for example, the next part of the validity assignment has students look at each of the assessments they created in the first part of the course and say which type of validity evidence is most relevant to each of those assignments. And so I'm using the concrete experience of them having developed a constructed response in an essay and a performance assessment. Here's the same student. This is a very, very sophisticated piece of engagement, right? So they're going through each of their assignments and imagining which kind of validity evidence is most relevant to them. Super, super important. Not have been possible without both the experience of having created the assignments as well as the experience of completing the first part of the assignment on validity. So this is very sophisticated. I have no idea what this would look like in a foreign language context. I'd love to work with someone, a team, to flesh that out and see what that would look like. You saw earlier those social engagement routines. This is a really important part. So these help students walk the walk and talk the talk. You don't require students. Students are instructed. You don't want to force students to comment on peer work like you often see in discussion forums, where you get this just boring stuff where it's obvious students are just talking for the sake of talking. Notice they posed a question, but you don't want students to answer those questions if they don't have the response. Really important. The social engagement, 90% of my time in my courses is spent engaging, participating in these threads, introducing more sophisticated concepts, rewarding students who are demonstrating PDE, asking questions that moves the conversation forward. This is the social engagement routine. These are embedded in every assignment. Students are instructed to post at least one question. So this is the key thing here. No discussion forums. All of the interaction takes place directly on the concrete format of student work. We have them discuss it like student work. We also have them promote student work. A little routine here with we call these stamps. And they're only allowed to give 1 each week. Those were very cherished in my course. So here you see that's that same student. Here's the question that she posted to her work. Here you see another student came in and gave her comment, and now embedded. Now there's a lot of this expansive framing is happening very naturally. Here you can see the student talking about something that they experienced in the prior semester. Super, super important here. By the way, the bold italics, those are my emphasis. Here you can see the student responding back, and here you see another student coming in and commenting on this comment. This is outstanding. most of my time is spent looking at those comments and coming in and saying, great discussion here, you're really getting at what you need to do. And then I go in and reiterate this really important thing that you have to think about the claims you're making when you're talking about validity and why validity is actually not that important in classroom assessment, because most claims are relatively modest, in reiterating this key point that I want to get across. So step 6 is wrapping up the sort of curriculum part of the model, and this is an optional step. I don't have any collaborative assignments in my assessment class. I have I really caution people. I think that a lot of online collaborative activities are ill-conceived. They frustrate students. My course is already highly interactive, so we don't need to come up with some made-up collaborative activity. We need to get collaboration happening. I think group work is often messy. It can be very frustrating online. And partly because it requires coordination and synchronicity. People, online activities, fully online stuff that's asynchronous is great because people can do it anytime, any place. If you add in the requirement that people have to coordinate, it can really frustrate students. When you do it, you have to be very careful. Now, I do have a routine in my cognition and education course. The students from the outset join one of 5 networking groups, depending on their specialty. They've been working together all semester. They do an identical routine, right? Because the last 5 chapters are dedicated to these areas. And so they do an expanded group wiki, and the lead group each week is required to provide feedback to the other groups. But other than that, I really caution people to be very, very careful doing collaborative activities. Okay, so now we're going to shift into the assessment part of this framework. When I said earlier that I embedded Randi Engle's ideas and her design principles into my multi-level assessment model, this is what I'm talking about. So uh, in this work, this is when I said that I really discovered that a situative perspective uncovers new solutions to enduring problems in formative and summative assessment. Particularly what I was talking about is the argument that my doctoral advisor, Jim Pellegrino, made in his National Research Council report, Knowing What Students Know, and elsewhere, that you can't use the same assessment for formative and summative functions. That's real, or summative purposes. And I have written, the last thing I wrote with him was an art where I kind of publicly disagreed with him and said, well, if you embrace a situative perspective that recognizes engagement, understanding, and achievement all as valid forms of learning that serve different purposes, then you can have, in this case, informal summative assessments of engagement that also function as informal formative assessments of understanding. These are important because if you do the previous steps right, you're going to have tons and tons of content. You don't want to grade it. Grading it undermines the discourse that you're trying to support, and it just sucks up huge amounts of time, and students want to argue with you. No, 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 just don't do it. Instead, if you have students reflect on their engagement and use that to award points for that engagement, you don't spend any time. I spend maybe 10 minutes a week grading in my class. Uh, as I'll show you, these assignments, while allowing me to summatively award points and assess their engagement, formatively advances their understanding. So students are asked to reflect. Now, I've spent many years refining these reflections. They build on the work of Melissa Grisolfi on consequential engagement. So, so what are you going to do differently? I'm sorry, contextual engagement. How well suited was your assignment? Uh, So the conceptual and cultural engagement, those really were just added in the last 2 years. The conceptual engagement, for example, is a way of motivating students and formatively assessing the self-assessments that they will have already completed that I'll show you next. The cultural engagement was a way of getting students to surface issues of race and gender and to open up that discussion, really important in a class about assessment where bias is important. Here you see that the student says, and consequential engagement, I really will understand the difference between reliability and validity. You can see that that collaborative engagement, I really appreciated B's example. So they're rewarding students for their peers. I had to look up for verification was the sources of validity evidence. That's both rewarding the students and summatively assessing what they did, right? So them to have something to say there. They were thinking about that while they were doing that self-assessment. The next step is to create self-assessments, right? So I'm really into formative assessment. I spent a lot of time refining these. I have some initial evidence how successful they are. I know that it gets me out of the business of providing students feedback on their formative assessments, which can be tremendously time consuming. It's one article I have. It's called The Conundrum of Formative Assessment, because all of the instructor's time that's taken away provided formative feedback, private one-on-one formative feedback, is time that inevitably comes out of engaging in that public feedback by moving that discourse forward. Instead, you structure the items in such a way, and you give careful instructions. And here's what this looks like in my course. So you should be able to write an acceptable answer to each of these questions without looking them up. So that's right, telling them, hey, when you're here, you should be able to answer each of these questions. If you haven't, you need to be slowing down a little bit. And knowing that they're going to have to do this in the end motivates them. If you can't write an answer, you should search for information. It's correction. It says there if you can, that should say if you can't. That's a typo. Then finally, you want to make sure that they carefully read an expert answer and explanation. So here's what this looks like. Here's one example from my class. There you can see the question. That's a good open-ended. In this case, that question's literally taken from the book that came with my textbook. Not hard. It's hard to write these kinds of questions well. Here you can see that indeed this pulled some of the evident information out from the student, and that explanation that's provided there is a more extended reiteration of that point. So this student at this moment is perfectly poised to make sense of what otherwise might be a kind of an abstract thing because it's grounded in their experience. But what they're doing here is ensuring, right, so these are known answer questions now. This is now, we're making sure that this student is going to be able to transfer. So this assessment is a summative assessment of their understanding, but it's a formative assessment of their achievement and their far transfer learning to make sure that the student can use this idea both on the exam as well as in some subsequent practice setting. So you take advantage of both Google Forms as well as most learning management systems allow you to time exams, which means students can't look up the items. So you get out of the business of proctoring exams. If you get the right kind of best answer items and you only give them 2 minutes per item, well, and those items are hard, well, you've got valid evidence that they're going to be able to use this knowledge in subsequent settings. However, you want to protect item and quiz security by not displaying all the items at once, only giving the answers to overall scores rather than the entire test. You want to use the item and test analysis resources inside the learning management system to improve your assessments. But you don't want to make these assessments. In my case, there were 3 20-item quizzes. Each of the quizzes only counted for 10%. Most of their points were for completing those engagement routines. So students don't freak out about the exams. And you make sure that a student who's engaging well, they might only get 80%, but that means they've only lost 2 out of 100 points in a 100-point class. This is what I mean by best answer items. You cannot look up these items, and in 2 minutes, there's no way you can learn enough to figure out which of those is correct. Okay? So another optional step is model videos or podcasts. Now, this is a really important point to be made. A lot of you are talking about using technology to deliver content. Um, Notice in my class, the content came from the textbook or it came from OERs, right? There's tons of good content out there. Creating content is laborious. It's a lot of work. It's hard to do well. Let other people do it for you. Rather, make conversational recordings. In my course, because I got a grant from Google to do the open online version of it, those are videos of me, semi-professionally produced videos of me. But I'm not delivering content. I'm explaining how those ideas are relevant to my case. Now, in this case, that's pretty easy because I'm talking, I can explain, hey, you guys know in this course, I use multiple choice assessments and I do it because it would take me too long. I don't want to grade your work. However, in my graduate courses, it wouldn't be inappropriate for me to use exams. I grade the papers that the students assign. There's only a few students and I give them a lot of feedback. In my courses I've developed on cyber learning for K-12 network and cybersecurity for K-12 network administrators, we made these really simple podcasts where we interviewed one network administrator or network analyst who's halfway through a degree in cybersecurity, as well as an experienced network administrator. Hey, what is the most important cybersecurity threat to each of you? In foreign language courses here at the DLI, I would say, yeah, have an advanced student, maybe a graduate interview another graduate as well as an instructor. The important thing is that they're using different perspectives to draw out the nuances like you want students to be engaging in. Finally, you might or might not do this. I have a lot of experience with microcredentials. The really important point I want to make here is that when students are engaging in these kinds of public documents, and talking with each other, you can put that evidence in the form of a link inside of an open digital badge. And that badge becomes evidence of students' ability to discuss these topics with their peers. There's the so-called 21st century skills. That's really important. Increasingly, the graduates of the Defense Language Institute courses are likely to be engaging in computer-mediated translation. So if these assignments are being completed in the foreign language of their course, well, that microcredential then is compelling evidence of their ability to engage in computer-mediated communication in their language. Importantly, though, is that evidence is there for somebody who has the time and the interest in looking at it. Let's get instructors out of this business of it's really, really difficult to formally assess the so-called 3 C's of communication, collaboration, and critical thinking skill. No, just put that evidence in the badge, give it to that learner, and let them present it to someone who cares about it enough to take the time to go in and look at it, and who has enough experience to immediately look at that interaction and judge whether or not that student was really engaging. So this is really simple to do now. All learning management systems make it possible to install Credly, or more importantly, Badger as an open Badges API. A new mod to Badger that I did in one of my projects, my consultancy with California, means that when someone submits their course, they have to give a URL. Well, that URL can be the URL of their G portfolio that they did using Google Docs in the course. So that's it for now. I hope this makes sense to you. Love to talk about this with people and search for opportunities to implement this framework in foreign language courses. Thank you very much.